All right, good afternoon, everyone. My clock has just ticked over to 12 noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. I suspect we'll have a few more people joining us shortly, but in the interest of time and to keep those of you that are on a tight schedule on track, we will go ahead. So let me start by saying welcome to this webinar, Plastic in the Ocean, What We Do and Do Not Know. There we go. My name is Maia McGuire. I work for the University of Florida, IFAS Extension, and Florida Sea Grant. And about 3 years ago, created the Florida Microplastic Awareness Project. For the third year, we are now celebrating the month of September, or promoting the month of September as Microplastic Awareness Month. And so we have 3 webinars that we have scheduled. This is the first of the 3, and then we will similarly have one next Thursday at noon and the following Thursday at noon. And the links for registering for those are there. I did realize that I did not set up the, for this webinar, I did not set up for it to give folks a reminder, but I have set the reminders for the other 2 webinars. So if you're registered for the others, you will get a reminder a day before and an hour before the webinar to help you find that link, make it a little bit easier for you to register. I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Lisa Krimsky. She is going to be helping out with this. She'll be keeping an eye on the chat box, and so you may hear her voice come in, or you may see things appear in the chat window. She will be trying to respond to questions, but also helping at the end of the webinar, helping make sure that I answer any questions that have not been addressed.
Hi, everyone.
There she is. So at this point, told you a little bit about us. I'd like to learn a little bit about who all is on the webinar. So I'm going to launch a little poll here and ask you just to give some responses to these 3 questions for me. So you should be able to click on your response. Yep, looks like people are managing to do that. So we'll give you a few seconds to give us some feedback.
And we had someone who raised their hand. If you can just type your question in the chat box, we can respond.
Okay, looks like most people are done with the poll. As I say that, more people add responses, but we'll go ahead and end it there. Thank you very much for that feedback. All right, so let's get on with the webinar. What we know and what we don't know about plastic pollution in the ocean. Much of the information in this webinar is based on a document that was sort of verbalized as a panel session at the 6th International Marine Debris Conference back in March in California. The panelists were Matthew Cole, Jenna Jambeck, and Kara Lavender Law, and they are some of the multitude of folks that provided input to a printed document that has this title. That document was produced by a group called the Plastic and Ocean Platform and was edited by the camp. There are a number of plastic researchers, both from the microplastic, but also the waste management side of the scheme of things, that contributed to the document. It has a wealth of information in it. It also has the citations for the sources for all of the information. So that is a really great resource. And if you've got questions about, where did the data come from, like this one that's cited here, it is all in that document. And we do have the link for that. In fact, Lisa, I'll just ask you to go ahead and put that link in the chat box if you don't mind, so folks can find that document if they want to refer to it later on. All right, so what do we know and what don't we know? We know a fair bit about plastic production over the years. We know that it is increasing. It is increasing fairly rapidly. And the numbers here will show you that. We also can estimate that this growth will continue and is not likely to slow down. We know some about the fate of the plastic that's been produced. If we think about 1950 as being the time frame when plastic really became kind of a consumer item, and we started making more and more consumer products out of plastic, the scientists estimate that some of that stuff, actually surprisingly almost a third of it, is still in use. We know that plastic lasts for a long time. We know that about 10% has been incinerated. This is often done to get energy back out of the plastic and as a way of dealing with the waste material. The rest of it, 60% of that 8 billion tons of plastic, has been discarded, and we really don't necessarily know where it is. We suspect that a large portion of it is in landfills, but also probably a pretty big portion has ended up in the natural environment, and in many cases that means the ocean. And this is a nice graphic from a publication that is available. It's an open access publication that was done by Jenna Jambeck along with two colleagues. Sorry, I was just looking for the reference. Geyer and Carol Lavender-Law and Jenna Jambeck, called Production, Use, and Fate of All Plastics Ever Made. And there are a number of nice graphics in there. So that is also open access, so that is available online, and the graphics can be downloaded as well. So what you can see here is what we know up to the present time are the solid lines, and then the dashed lines are projections into the future in terms of generation, what's gets discarded as waste, what's been incinerated, and what's been recycled. And obviously the recycle line is the lowest of the bunch at this point. All of these trends are projected to continue increasing. The interesting thing to me is that all waste discarded, they project to kind of level out, whereas the others continue increasing at about the same rate. But basically this is a problem that we don't anticipate is going to go away anytime soon. So when we think about the world, who's producing the most waste? Where is most of it coming from? So this is a paper from Jenna Jambeck and her team. This is a very well-known paper from Science in 2015. And we know that a lot of it is coming from Asia, but also the United States. We know that rivers transport a lot of plastics to the ocean, and in particular, 10 rivers seem to be producing about 90% of waste to the ocean, the plastic waste to the ocean. 8 of those are in Asia and 2 in Africa. And we also know that we have certain industry sectors that are more responsible for waste than others. Packaging, textiles, and the consumer and institutional products. So a question that people always want to know the answer to is, how much plastic is there in the ocean? And this is one of those great big we don't know questions. The biggest challenge we have in answering this question, the reason we can't answer this question, is we don't have standardized, comprehensive methods of sampling the ocean to look for plastic, and even consensus on how to quantify plastic. A lot of papers will report numbers, some papers will report mass. We know that some of the methods of collecting the plastics will let the smallest plastics pass through them. So while they are effective at sampling large volumes of water, they're not necessarily comprehensive. By contrast, if you sample whole water samples and filter them through very small filters, you're only getting a small volume. So you're missing a lot of the larger pieces of plastic. And so there's this challenge there just from the sample collection process. But there's also an issue with different densities of plastic being in different locations in the water column. So when we think about the water column and think about the density of seawater and the density of different plastics, I thought this was a really nice graphic to show that we have some plastic that is lower density in the seawater. So it is going to float very close to, right at the surface. Of course, wave action will help mix it to different depths, but in a totally calm situation, it would be floating at the surface. So that includes things like the polypropylene, polyethylene, and the expanded polystyrene. So what we think of as foam, styrofoam foam. All of those products are less dense than seawater. Then we get into some things that are kind of really close to the same density of seawater. Polystyrene that's not got the air added to it, not expanded foam. Nylon, they're a little more dense than seawater, but they're not the densest of all the plastics. Cellulose acetate, so the plant-based plastic that is often used in cigarette filters, is one of the higher densities, along with the polyethylene terephthalate, the PET that we use to make soft drink bottles and water bottles out of, our polyester fabric, which is essentially the same plastic as PET, and PVC. Those are all significantly denser than the seawater, and so they tend to sink to the bottom. So you can just see from this graphic that depending on where you are able to sample in the water column, you might find or miss certain groups of plastics. And this is one of the things that contributes to the difficulty in answering that question of how much plastic is there in the ocean. Depends where you sample, how you sample, and what you're able to identify. So a lot of the awareness about plastics in the ocean started around the late 90s, early 2000s, with this discovery that there were these accumulation areas, these gyres in the ocean, where you found large amounts of plastic, and particularly very small plastics. And they became known as the most famous one, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but they get referred to as garbage patches in the different ocean gyres. And that term is a little bit unfortunate because if we go back to the previous slide, remember that plastic isn't all going to float. And the use of the term garbage patch or floating island of garbage gives the impression that all of this plastic waste is floating at the surface and is actually forming, something that could be walked across. And that's not the case. The film, The Smog of the Sea, that some of you may have seen, one of the reasons I think that they made that film, that Five Gyres and other folks made that film, was to stress this point, that a lot of the plastic that's in the ocean is in the form of really small particles that A, are not visible to the naked eye in the ocean, and B, don't form a solid mass that can be walked on and aren't even necessarily at the surface. So when people ask the question, is that where most of the ocean's plastic is? Again, not necessarily. And because we don't have these good sampling methods, we can't really answer that question completely either. But we do know that people who have sampled outside of these gyres do still find high levels of plastic pollution. So this is certainly not the only place where plastic accumulates in the ocean. But how much of the plastic is there, what proportion of the plastic is there, that's another one of those. We need to get better sampling protocols and procedures in order to answer that. And we also need to make sure we've sampled every possible area to have for comparison. How long do plastics last in the natural environment? That's another one that we don't necessarily have a definite answer for. Many of you have seen the marine debris timelines, and I have used those and shared those. But the question always comes up, well, how do we know monofilament fishing line lasts 600 years in the environment when we haven't had monofilament fishing line for 600 years? And that's a great question. And the answer is we don't really know. But what we do know is that a lot of the plastics persist for a very long time. So when we think about something being biodegradable, the description that I like to use is that something is biodegradable if it reverts back into the elements that it's made up from in a reasonable time frame, and that's usually considered to be weeks to months when we think about whether to describe something as biodegradable or not. We know that most, if not all, of the plastics, even the plant-based plastics, will last for decades or longer in the environment. So by using that definition of biodegradable, it is very fair to say that plastics are not biodegradable. But of course, the environmental conditions are going to affect how quickly plastic degrades. Now, most of the time when plastic's degrading, it is just breaking apart into smaller pieces. So we know ultraviolet light will cause plastic to degrade more rapidly. Heat and cold can both have impacts on making plastic degrade. The type of plastic, the form of the plastic itself, can also affect how quickly it degrades. And so it is really difficult to answer the question of how long plastics last in the natural environment. That's really one of those, well, it depends kind of questions. There has been a study done looking at those PET bottles, so that would be like the single-use water bottles or beverage bottles, and they estimate that the bottles can persist between 35 and 180 years. But that is not before they biodegrade, that is before they fall apart into little pieces in wet soil. So that's in one particular environment, and it's just looking at the physical breakdown and not the chemical decomposition back into the elemental forms. We suspect that degradation rates are slower in the ocean, again, especially the deep ocean. Colder temperatures, lack of UV light are things that would potentially slow that degradation rate. So in addition to people wanting to know how much plastic is in the ocean, we're really interested in figuring out if the amount of plastic in the ocean is increasing. We know that the amount of plastic that's being made is steadily increasing. We know there have been some studies that have been done and repeated over time using the same methods in the same locations, showing increases in plastic. But you see here the second bullet, since about 2000, there has not been a measured increase in microplastic concentration in the Pacific or the Atlantic. And the answer to the why is this question is really related to some of the things that I've already said. We know that not all the plastic is at the surface, yet when we study microplastics in the ocean, we are typically sampling surface water using manta trawls, Newston nets, or whole water sampling. That's almost always done at the surface. And again, we don't have methods for sampling the deep water, for measuring the sediments, especially in the deep sea. And so it could well be that more stuff is getting added into the oceans, but it's not in the surface water that we're sampling, and therefore we're not able to detect it, to measure it, in order to answer the question of whether plastic in the ocean is increasing. So people always want to know, how do microplastics affect marine life? And this is another one of those questions that we don't really have a lot of answers for at this point. We do know some things about plastics and ways that they could potentially affect marine life. And the big ones have to do with toxic chemicals. We know that things that we add to the plastic, things like flame retardants, plasticizers, the group of chemicals called phthalates, the BPA, bisphenol A, those are all chemicals that we add to the plastic to give them the properties that we want the plastic to have. And they are also, almost all of them, believed to be or known to be endocrine disruptors. So they can have effects on organisms' reproduction and larval development. So there's a potential effects if those organisms are exposed to plastics. We know those chemicals can leach out of the plastics into ocean water. And so that is potentially a way that plastics could have an impact on marine life. We also know that a lot of the persistent organic pollutants will stick to the surface of plastic and ocean water. So this is things like the DDT pesticides, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the PCBs, these hydrophobic chemicals that like to stick to plastic because it is oil-based, essentially. And we also know that those chemicals will disassociate from the plastic and get into the animal tissues. But documenting this stuff in lab studies or in studies using marine life, there have been very few published studies, and most of the studies that look at the impacts on plastics and marine life don't necessarily answer the "why is this happening" question. So there was a study published a couple of years ago looking at Pacific oysters. They exposed the oysters to, they put plastics in the water, and they looked at the reproductive output of the oysters. And of course their control animals did not have plastic added to their water. And what they found was that there was lower egg production, lower sperm motility, and the larvae that were produced were slower and less successful at developing and growing. So that implies that yes, plastic had an impact on them, but we don't necessarily know in what way. Was it the chemicals in the plastic? Was it that there's an energetic cost to the oysters in eating the plastic and then having to expel them as waste? We really don't know the answer to that. There have been a number of studies that have looked at plastics and exposed organisms to plastics and not found any impact. The whole question of environmental relevance is a really difficult one, because if we don't know how much plastic is in the water, how do we know how much we should add to the water in our studies? And what types of plastics should we be using? All of these things are variables that we don't really know how to incorporate into the studies. So typically studies use a single type of plastic. It's very often polystyrene that they use. But is that a type of plastic that these organisms are going to be exposed to? Don't really know. It's one of the denser plastics, so it's possible that it's one that organisms living on the bottom, because that's usually the types of organisms that are used for these studies, would run across. But is it the only one? Is it the most common one? You know, we have so many questions that we don't have the answers to. It makes it difficult to address some of these other questions that we would like to be able to answer. And then we get to the elephant in the room, which is, well, forget the organisms, what about us, right? And this is a question that, again, we don't have a good answer to. It is a question that's been being bounced around for at least 14, 15 years. We know that microplastics are in some of the seafood that we eat. And especially when you think about the filter feeders like oysters, other shellfish, where we eat the entire organism, including their guts, then there's a good chance that we are swallowing microplastics when we swallow that seafood. But so what? Because we also know that microplastics are in the air, that the majority of these microplastics are in the form of fibers, and that they don't stay in the air, they fall out. And that means they get into pretty much anything that we eat, not just seafood, and not just stuff that we eat. We are probably breathing these things every day. We are probably drinking them in whatever beverage we drink, in whatever container we have it in. We know, thanks to Sam Mason and many others, that microplastics are found in tap water, bottled water, beer, sea salt, oysters, mussels. And we don't necessarily know how those microplastics get into some of these products, like tap water, bottled water. Are they coming through the water that is then put into our glass or into these bottles? Or are they coming from the air that that water gets exposed to in the process? Or are they coming from the bottling process itself? With the bottled water study, one of the most common types of plastic that was found was blue polypropylene. Well, that happens to be what a lot of the water bottle caps are made out of. And so that sort of implies that it's an artifact of the bottling process that resulted in at least some of those microplastics ending up in that bottled water. With tap water, I've asked Dr. Mason, do you think it's coming from the waste or from the water treatment plant, or do you think it's more just a factor of the water getting from the tap into whatever container it was filled that was then used to analyze the water? In other words, was it from the water running through air into the container? And of course, she doesn't know the answer to that question, but she did agree that it could well be a contamination issue, basically the water getting contaminated by the air, that it's not necessarily the water coming from the water treatment plant that contains these plastics. So with that, came pretty close on time. I'm going to see if we have any questions.
There are no questions in the chat box, so if you have any questions now, please type them in.
And while you're doing that, I do have one other poll to ask you to fill out. Of course, I have to change to the proper poll. There we go. So just a really short little evaluation. I'll ask you to give me your feedback through. And I will remind people about our webinar next week and then the following Thursday, so September 13th and September 20th at the same time. And if you need links for those, feel free to email me. Okay, I do see some questions coming through in the chat. Okay, Linda wanted to know if the webinar will be available as a recording. Yes, and I will be emailing you all the links to that. My hope is to get that uploaded to the Microplastic Awareness Project website, which is plasticaware.org, on the Multimedia and Outreach Materials page this afternoon, but I will be sending you a link so that you can access that recording. And anybody that was not able to participate in person, and anybody that wants to watch it will also be able to get it. Have there been any studies looking at the differences in microplastic concentrations from groundwater sources versus surface water, reverse osmosis, etc.? I have not seen direct comparison studies like that. People are starting to look at things like spring water, so that would be more the groundwater source. There have been a number of studies looking at surface water in different locations. I'm not aware, I'm trying to think if I have seen any studies dealing with reverse osmosis. I don't remember coming across one. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been one. I am a little bit behind on the literature at the moment. But I will mention that the issue of aerial contamination is a big challenge when it comes to doing some of these analyses and looking for microplastics. Needs to be done under very controlled conditions, preferably using a laminar flow hood to prevent any of the microplastics in the air from being able to get into a sample that you're analyzing, and so on. So that's a bit of a tricky thing to try and address. I see a question about recommendations for alternative products for things like styrofoam or other plastic. And that is a great question. And a lot of it depends on what type of product you're looking for. So I've worked with my local school district. They have switched from using styrofoam food trays to using trays made from paper fiber or wood pulp. They are looking at switching from plastic utensils to utensils made from birch, which is a wood. It's a sustainable, or it's a Forest Stewardship Council certified product. Cups are difficult to find alternatives to or alternatives for, because most of the alternatives that will hold the liquid are still plastic coated. So even if they're paper cups, they're still plastic coated. So when it comes to needing something for a single use type product, something if you don't have the ability to use a reusable thing and wash it, cups are really challenging. And we're looking for resources. I found out about I'm trying to remember what it's called, a Green Restaurant Association program that does have product recommendations, but they're not the types of products that they don't cover the full spectrum. So they have things like to-go boxes, but they don't necessarily have utensils or cups, things like that. So obviously the preferred choice would be something reusable, washable, but we recognize that isn't always feasible. So things that are made from plant fiber that are biodegradable as opposed to plant-based plastic would be good alternatives. Plant-based plastics, as you'll learn in the third webinar, are not necessarily any better in the environment than petroleum-based plastics. So unless you have industrial composting facilities available, those plant-based plastics are not necessarily a good alternative. Okay, next question. What would be the most important aspect of educating others on microplastics, in your opinion? I think for me, the most important thing, the most important message that I try to get across to people is that we can all make a difference. And in the next webinar, we're going to address some of the different levels from individual up to corporate up to industry. But I think it's easy for people to feel like they can't make a difference because they're only one person. And I don't accept that argument. I don't think that that's true. I think that we can all make a difference by changing our own behavior. And really we focus on educating people about trying to reduce the single-use plastics that they get and then dispose of. Improving recycling is good, but finding alternatives to getting that plastic product in the first place are ideal, but again, not always possible. Will the slides be available for viewing? The recording will be available. If you would like the PowerPoint, if you send me an email, I'll be happy to share the entire PowerPoint with you. But the recording will be the easier thing to find. Do secondary microplastics derived from degradation already exist? Absolutely. Yeah. When we collect water samples and look at them, you find film fragments, few microbeads, and a lot of fibers, and all of those are considered secondary microplastics, and they have come to be, actually, take that back. The microbeads are not considered secondary, but the film, little pieces of like plastic wrap type thing, the fibers and the fragments are all derived from degradation. So, okay, Sybil wants to know about the specific compounds that are contaminating plastic, so the different types of toxins. Sybil, I'm not sure specifically. I mean, we know that things like the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the PCBs, the DDT pesticides, there have been studies. Chelsea Rockman did a study in California where she submerged nurdles, so plastic pellets, in the harbor and then tested to find out what different kinds of chemicals were on them. And that's something that I can easily share with you. But those are the main groups of compounds that come from the water. And then as to what's in the plastics themselves, it is those polyaromatic, or the phthalates, the BPA, bisphenol A, and the flame retardants are the three that are of highest concern because of their potential endocrine disruptor effects. Okay. Ooh, Jen, that's a great question. Jen Lomberg wants to know, on the graph that showed the trends in garbage being produced, disposed of, incinerated, recycled, it showed the recycling continuing to trend upward. And her question is, with China refusing to accept recyclable materials in the future, what might account for the continued increase? I suspect that that is because of pushes from industry. And next week, we'll have Stu Harris from the American Chemistry Council co-presenting with me, and he is actually going to address some of what industry is trying to do to increase the amount of recycling that is done. A number of states have initiatives and they have goals to increase the amount of plastic materials that are recycled. So I suspect that that's why the graph anticipates increases in recycling, even though China is no longer a venue for other countries to send its plastics to. A question about the art images. Where did the art images come from that I used throughout my presentation? Some of them, like the one on this final question slide, that's a photograph that I took at the Marine Debris Conference. They had several pieces of artwork that were made with plastic. Some of the illustrations came from NOAA's Marine Debris Program. They do a contest each year for school kids, and you can find those images on NOAA Marine Debris Program's website. Are there any habitats or environments on the planet where plastics or microplastics have not yet been found? I don't think so. I know I have seen a number of papers sampling, remote mountain lakes and places where people thought would not be contaminated with plastics, and particularly those microplastics. I think because of the aerial transport, they do tend to find their way everywhere. What is our opinion about the importance of sticking to science and what we know versus relaying alarmist information in regards to education and outreach to the general public, raising awareness? How can we be efficient in the message, be convincing but correct? That is a really good question, because as I hope I made clear in this presentation, there is a lot that we do not know. But there is still a lot that we do know, and there is a lot that we have good reason to anticipate. But I do hope that people are careful about not hyping some of this stuff, and I know there's a tendency for that. I don't know if there's Lynn, if you had any particular alarmist information that you were concerned about. I think it is important to give people the information that we do know and to be straightforward about what we don't know. But also, it's fair to raise possibilities and let people make their own choices. So I hope that answers that. Any other thoughts on answering the question, so what, when addressing the public with the intent of them reducing plastic for ocean health? I think, Linda, that you're, if I'm interpreting this correctly, you're saying that the public's reaction, if you ask them to reduce their plastic waste, is kind of why. And when people ask me that, and this somewhat relates back to the previous question, if we don't have evidence, then how can we convince people? And there is something in science called the Precautionary Principle, and that is, if we have a scientific basis that shows that it is possible that something would happen or likely that something will happen, then it makes sense to take action to try and prevent that. It's a situation of, if we wait until we have an impact, then maybe it's too late at that point. And so that's what I try and share with folks. Just because we don't necessarily know or have data for something, if there is, for example, we know that some of the chemicals that are added to plastic are endocrine disruptors. And so we know, even though we didn't necessarily have babies being, having developmental issues related to consuming BPA, we did remove BPA from baby bottles and other plastic items that are intended to contain food. So I don't know if that helps, but hopefully that kind of gives you one example where we've used the precautionary principle to help prevent something without necessarily having the data that that bad thing was going to happen. Okay, are milk cartons coated in plastic too? Yes. We tend to think of milk and juice cartons as being wax coated, but these days they are actually coated with plastic. Some recycling facilities are able to accept those, and they literally separate the plastic from the paper and recycle the two separately, but a lot of recycling or waste haulers are not necessarily set up to do that. What relevant studies have been done to remove microplastics in the ocean? The challenge with microplastics is the majority of them are very, 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 very small. So when I talked about those nets that are used for sampling the ocean, 100 microns is 1/10 of a millimeter. And we know that a large number of the fibers will pass through those 100 micron nets because in diameter they are less than 100 microns. So removing microplastics from the ocean is not seen as being something feasible, because in order to remove the plastics, you would also have to remove anything bigger than the plastics, which is going to include pretty much all of the plankton and a lot of the bacteria for that matter. So I don't know of any studies to try and remove microplastics from the ocean. Chad's got a question about using plant-based plastic for restoration and specifically for oysters. Had a conversation about that this morning, and I've talked with the Nature Conservancy about the bees, the potato-based bioplastic. Without giving too much away, those plant-based plastics are not any better for the environment than petroleum-based plastics. And we'll talk more about that in the third webinar. Alternative recommendations for restoration, it's a challenge. I don't know of any that have been accepted as being viable because of the challenge of needing to have something that has a long enough lifespan to allow the restoration to actually take effect for in the case of oysters, for other oysters to colonize and sort of stabilize the oyster reef before they break apart, but then we'd like them to break apart and biodegrade in the long run. There may be, what may be an alternative are the PHA plastics, which are bacterial waste-based plastics. And again, we will talk about those in the third webinar. Okay. Can you provide more data on the U.S. contribution to plastics entering the oceans? That would be a Jenna Jambek question. I don't have those data, but I am sure that they exist. I'm trying to think what the best way is to try and find it and share it. Yeah, unfortunately, at this point, my best recommendation would be to look up some of Jenna Jambek's work and kind of mine it or contact her directly. She's at University of Georgia for U.S. contribution. She deals with waste management and waste mismanagement. She's the one that has contributed to a couple of papers that I showed figures from in this presentation, but I don't know it off the top of my head. Is it better to recycle plastic, or if you have a waste to energy plant, to just put it in the trash? That's a really good question. And it's going to depend to some extent on your location and your waste management haulers, because we know that some plastics that are, even though they are recyclable, if they're collected to be recycled, they aren't necessarily recycled, and that can be for a number of different reasons. It can be because nobody wants to purchase them. It can be because somebody in the stream has put in the wrong products that have ended up contaminating a load. So trying to recycle plastic may not always result in the plastic getting recycled. Waste to energy plants, it takes more energy to make plastic than you get out of it by incinerating it. But if locations do have the ability to turn their plastics into energy, to burn them for energy, depending on the location, that might be a better option than recycling. I don't really know the answer to which is better. I wouldn't say just put it in the, well, I guess, sorry. The question had to do with if you have a waste to energy plant, are you better off to just put it in the trash? Yeah, so I don't really know. That is a good question. That's something I'll need to research.
Maya, you skipped the previous question from Marina.
Yeah. There's a question about the Ocean Cleanup Project. The Ocean Cleanup Project is the thing with the booms that I guess they're starting to implement out in the ocean to try and collect ocean plastic. I don't know enough about it. There has not been the data, the specifics have not been readily available. I am skeptical. I am concerned about the potential impact on ocean wildlife, and I'm not convinced that it's not going to be an issue when it comes to shipping. And I really don't have a good feel for the feasibility of how much plastic it will be able to remove. So I don't have enough information about the Ocean Cleanup Project to be able to form a sort of an educated opinion on how effective it is likely to be. How big of an impact do you think grocery stores like Kroger's will have on plastic bag production, and Starbucks with their new lid program? Do you think other industries will follow suit, and will it be enough to change the production curve? I'm not sure what's meant by how big of an impact grocery stores will have on plastic bag production. I suspect that you're asking whether large grocery stores will basically be able to influence the continued production of the thin plastic bags. And I suspect that that's probably pretty likely, at least for the short term. Starbucks with their new lid program, and will other industries follow suit? Some of these alternative programs have their pros and cons. They probably all have their pros and cons. Some of them I think are a little more feel-good programs than actually effective. And so I'm just going to encourage people to look, and I'm not commenting on any specific store's efforts here, but I do encourage you to take a holistic look at some of the changes that companies are making and make your own decision about, is this actually better long term, or do I have, is there something more that I could do? So something like Starbucks, I'd say take your own cup, you know, because they'll do that. I don't know the details of their new lid program, but I think that there's a lot of peer pressure. I think that businesses are feeling like they need to be able to say that they're making a difference. Will it change the production curve? I think that's probably a good question for Stu next week. See what he thinks about that, because he works a lot more with the industries. Are the paper bags from grocery stores also plastic coated? No, they are not. Well, let me take that back. The grocery bags that I'm familiar with, the brown paper grocery bags, are not plastic coated. If you think about like gift bags and things like that, then yes, they are. Okay. Looking at what our last question here. Oh, okay. So Linda's question has to do with the plastic fibers in the air. Are we beginning to language this as a biosphere problem as opposed to ocean problem, since there's so much microplastic in the air? That's a great question, Linda. I think that perhaps there is starting to be more of an acknowledgement that this is more of a biosphere problem. This is another one of those things that we still don't have a lot of data to help us address, because we don't know a lot about microplastics in the air, their transport in the air. That's something that's really only come to light in the last couple of years. Up till now, we've sort of been blaming wastewater treatment plants as one of the big bad guy sources. And we acknowledge that, yes, wastewater treatment plants do contribute some to the ocean for sure. But I am wondering if we don't know what the relative proportion is of, say, fibers in the air compared with fibers that are getting contributed by wastewater treatment plants. Because again, we don't have a really good way of studying the air, the atmosphere. So this is a new area that I think people are just starting to research. So I think I made it through all the questions. Appreciate those of you who've stuck through with us for the extra 25 minutes or so that we just took. If people do have additional questions or anything else that they want to share, please feel free to email me. I thank you all for participating. And with that, I think we will call it a wrap. Thanks, everybody.